This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Jamie had been born into a world of rigidity, where every aspect of life was controlled by rules and expectations set long before they had even taken their first breath. Growing up in a remote, rural town in Texas, Jamie's family was deeply entrenched in conservative beliefs that shaped everything they did. The Mahoneys were well known in the community, not for wealth or influence, but for their strict adherence to traditional values and their reputation for being a large, obedient family. Jamie was the oldest of 7 children, each child expected to live up to the same unforgiving standards. But for Jamie, who felt like an outsider even within their own family, the expectations were an impossible burden. Life in the Mahoney household was built around rules and discipline. The home was modest, a worn-down farmhouse with squeaking floors and faded wallpaper that reflected the austerity of their lives. Every day began with the same routine: early rising, long prayers, and hours spent performing chores, where Jamie and their siblings were expected to work diligently under the watchful eyes of their parents. The days felt endless, a continuous cycle of cleaning, cooking, and yard work, with strict gender roles governing what tasks each child was assigned. Jamie was expected to set an example for the younger children, to be a leader, but deep down, they felt a growing sense of rebellion against a system that left no room for individuality or self-expression. From a young age, Jamie knew that something about them was different, though they couldn't quite articulate what it was. They felt uncomfortable with the rigid role that was imposed upon them, the enforced conformity that seemed to suffocate every part of their being. Jamie was expected to act, speak, and even think in a way that aligned with the family's conservative beliefs. They were told that straying from these expectations was sinful, a betrayal not only of their family but of God. Jamie's parents, devoutly religious, ruled the home with an iron will cloaked in piety. Their father, Richard, was especially strict, believing that his role as head of the household meant enforcing moral discipline at any cost. He saw any act of defiance as a direct challenge to his authority, and he responded to even minor infractions with swift, often harsh punishment. For Jamie, these punishments became a routine part of life. Averted eyes, lowered voices, and bowed heads were the only acceptable responses to their father's commands. Any sign of questioning or resistance was met with scorn, and when Jamie began to question their identity, the repercussions grew harsher. The shame and confusion they felt were compounded by their parents' firm belief in curing any behavior that seemed unusual or rebellious. Jamie was subjected to lectures on sin and obedience, sermons that seemed to echo through every corner of their home. Jamie learned early on that expressing who they truly were would only bring more pain, and so they withdrew, creating an inner world where they could at least acknowledge their true self, even if only in secret. As Jamie entered adolescence, the inner conflict they felt began to intensify. Puberty brought with it a new wave of discomfort, as Jamie struggled with a body that felt increasingly foreign. In the mirror, they saw someone they could not recognize, someone forced into a mold that didn't fit. This feeling of estrangement was isolating, and with no one to confide in, Jamie felt utterly alone. Their only interactions were with family members who viewed any deviation from their strict norms as a threat to the household's stability. They longed for understanding, for connection, but found only judgment and condemnation within the walls of their home. The isolation at home was mirrored in the small, conservative community that surrounded them. The town was a close-knit place where everyone knew each other, and privacy was a luxury few could afford. Gossip spread quickly, and any hint of difference or dissent was met with suspicion. Jamie had learned early on to keep to themselves, to avoid drawing attention or giving anyone reason to question their family's perfect image. But the effort of maintaining this facade weighed heavily on them, creating a deep well of resentment that simmered just below the surface. Jamie's anger, fueled by years of suppression and mistreatment, grew with each passing day. School, once a potential escape, offered little relief. Jamie's parents had taught them that education was secondary to obedience, and that any ideas that contradicted their beliefs were to be ignored. As a result, Jamie's school experience was limited and closely monitored, with any expression of independent thought met with swift reprimand. They weren't allowed to participate in after-school activities or socialize with other students. Friendships were discouraged, especially with anyone their parents deemed influenced by secular ideas. Jamie was an outsider, isolated from their peers and held at arm's length by their family, who saw any connection to the outside world as a threat. In moments of desperation, Jamie found solace in books, the few they could secretly borrow from the small library, hiding them beneath their bed and reading late at night when the rest of the household was asleep. These books were Jamie's only window into a world beyond the farm, glimpses of lives filled with freedom, individuality, and acceptance. They read stories of people who had overcome adversity, characters who defied expectations and broke free from oppressive lives. These stories gave Jamie a sense of hope, a belief that somewhere, somehow, there was a life beyond the confines of their family's rigid beliefs. Around the age of 16, Jamie discovered online communities where they could explore topics related to gender identity and self-acceptance. These forums and websites became their refuge, a place where they finally felt seen and understood. For the first time, Jamie found words that described what they had felt all their life, a disconnect between the identity they had been forced to wear and the person they truly were. Through these communities, Jamie realized that they were not alone and that others had faced similar struggles. The knowledge gave them a fragile sense of validation, a glimmer of hope that they could one day live authentically. However, this newfound understanding only deepened the chasm between Jamie and their family. The more they learned, the more they resented the life they were trapped in. They began to see their parents as enforcers of a doctrine that stifled individuality, an oppressive force that sought to erase any sense of self that did not align with their narrow beliefs. Each day, Jamie felt the weight of their family's control pressing down on them, choking out any hope of self-expression or freedom. The anger within them grew, fueled by years of mistreatment, isolation, and the realization that their family would never accept them as they were. Jamie's life became a cycle of repression and quiet defiance. They moved through the days performing the duties expected of them, outwardly obedient but inwardly seething with resentment. The disconnect between their inner and outer selves widened, creating a void that left them feeling hollow, trapped between the person they were forced to be and the person they longed to become. The simmering anger began to transform into a dark resolve, a belief that the only way to escape was to destroy the very foundation of the life that had imprisoned them. The years of mistreatment, the isolation, and the suffocating control of their family created a perfect storm within Jamie, a storm that would eventually lead to a tragic and violent confrontation. As they prepared to act, Jamie found themselves past the point of guilt or fear. In their mind, they were reclaiming the life that had been denied to them, breaking free from a world that had offered only pain and confinement. As Jamie approached their 17th birthday, the isolation and repression they had lived with for so long began to erode their patience and will. Each day felt like an eternity, every hour measured by the duties imposed upon them and the stifling expectations that had ruled their life since birth. The Mahoney household was ruled by rules and silence, and every moment seemed to underline how distant they were from the life they yearned to live. Jamie's parents, Richard and Marie, were strict to the point of severity, their devotion to their faith and family values their highest priority. But to Jamie, their home had become a place of oppression, where every aspect of their identity was denied and invalidated, reduced to something shameful and foreign. The small moments of hope and understanding Jamie had found through the online communities they visited late at night only heightened their frustration. Through their phone, hidden beneath their mattress or tucked under their clothes, Jamie had glimpsed a world of self-acceptance and authenticity. They had read about people whose stories mirrored their own, people who had found ways to escape and live as their true selves. This knowledge had planted a seed of hope, but as days turned into weeks, that hope transformed into a bitter realization Jamie's own family would never allow them that freedom. Each time they returned from their digital refuge to the world of their family, the gap between their reality and the life they wanted felt like a chasm that could never be bridged. As Jamie's frustration mounted, so did the strictness of their parents' expectations. They became acutely aware of the constant scrutiny they were under. Every movement, every word, every glance monitored and analyzed for signs of defiance. Their parents' teachings had always enforced the importance of discipline and obedience, with Richard often reminding his children of the need to uphold the family's moral values. Jamie's mother, Marie, supported Richard unquestioningly, holding their children to the same impossible standards she imposed upon herself. There was no space for rebellion, no room for independent thought, and certainly no acceptance of anything outside the strict definitions of gender and faith that governed their lives. The family's scrutiny turned especially sharp as Jamie's identity became harder to suppress. They had started making small, discreet changes, attempts to express their true self in ways they thought would go unnoticed. They would adjust their appearance slightly, wearing clothes that felt more comfortable, allowing brief moments where they could feel more aligned with their identity. But these small acts of defiance did not go unnoticed. Their father's temper flared more frequently, his voice cutting through the house like a blade as he admonished Jamie for what he called sinful influences and immoral thoughts. Each reprimand added another layer of shame, another reminder that who they were was something forbidden, something their family saw as a threat to their faith. The punishments grew harsher as Jamie's frustration showed through. Any deviation from the family's rigid standards was met with long lectures, prayers for forgiveness, and increasingly severe restrictions. Jamie's siblings, too young to understand the tension building between Jamie and their parents, watched from a distance, sensing the growing strain without knowing its cause. For Jamie, each punishment felt like an assault on their identity, a systematic attempt to erase everything they knew themselves to be. Their parents' words, "God doesn't make mistakes. Obedience is the path to salvation," became a mantra they grew to despise, a symbol of the prison they felt trapped within. Eventually, Jamie reached a point of no return. Their small attempts to express their identity had become a lifeline, a fragile tether to the person they knew they were meant to be. Each time they looked in the mirror, they felt more disconnected, more alienated from the image staring back at them. Their parents' denial of their identity, their refusal to see Jamie for who they truly were, left a deep wound that no amount of love or faith could heal. Jamie began to see their parents not as protectors or guardians, but as jailers, figures who were determined to keep them confined within a narrow life that felt like a lie. The breaking point came one evening when Jamie's father discovered some personal items they had hidden in a drawer. These small possessions, a few clothes, some jewelry, small mementos that reflected Jamie's true identity, were Jamie's most precious belongings, tokens of the person they were becoming. Finding them felt like an invasion, a violation that shattered the last remnants of Jamie's patience. Richard's reaction was swift and severe, his anger erupting in a way that left no room for understanding or compassion. He destroyed the items, discarding them as though they were garbage, his words cutting Jamie down, leaving them with a hollow emptiness that seemed to settle in their chest like a weight they could never lift. This event marked a turning point for Jamie. The rage that had simmered beneath the surface for so long finally broke free, a torrent of resentment and despair that they could no longer contain. They felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal not only by their family, but by the very life they had been forced to lead. Jamie's anger solidified into a cold, calculating determination, a belief that their only escape from this prison was to remove the forces that kept them trapped. They began to view their family not as kin but as obstacles, people who had systematically denied them their humanity, who had tried to erase them simply for wanting to be themselves. In the days that followed, Jamie's mind became consumed with thoughts of revenge, of liberation, and of an escape that only seemed possible through drastic means. They replayed their father's actions over and over, each memory a reminder of the life they had been denied, of the future that had been ripped away from them piece by piece. Every insult, every punishment, every restriction they had endured fueled a dark resolve within them. Their mind drifted to the idea of finality, a way to end the pain, to break free from the shackles of their past and start anew, unburdened by the weight of family expectations. Jamie began to plan. They spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, running through every detail in their mind. The idea of escape had once seemed impossible, a fleeting fantasy they could never realize. But now it felt within reach, like something tangible they could grasp if they just had the courage to act. The planning became an obsession, a way to channel the anger and frustration that had consumed them. They took careful steps, making sure to avoid suspicion, all the while hiding their intentions behind a mask of calm obedience. In their mind, Jamie's thoughts grew darker and more resolute. They saw their family as the root of their suffering, the force that had smothered every hope, every dream, every attempt to live authentically. The love they had once held for their parents and siblings had been eroded by years of judgment and rejection, leaving only a hollow resentment. The oppressive rules, the relentless punishments, and the unwavering condemnation had pushed Jamie to the edge, and now they were ready to take action. As Jamie's plans took shape, they felt a strange sense of peace. The fear that had once plagued them, the self-doubt and guilt, began to fade, replaced by a cold determination. They were past the point of return, beyond any hesitation or second-guessing. For the first time in their life, Jamie felt a sense of control, a belief that they could finally break free from the life that had been forced upon them. The breaking point had come and gone, and Jamie was ready to do whatever it took to escape. When Jamie finally made the decision to begin living as their true self, it felt like stepping into a new world, a world where, for the first time, they could shed the suffocating expectations that had defined their entire life. The journey toward a new identity wasn't something Jamie had chosen lightly. It was a deeply personal decision, one they had weighed over countless sleepless nights. Despite the risks, despite the inevitable backlash they would face from their family, Jamie felt an overwhelming need to claim their identity, to live authentically even within the constraints of a life that felt like a prison. Their journey began in secrecy. Jamie first experimented in small ways, quietly testing the waters of self-expression in moments when they could be alone. There were early mornings before the rest of the family awoke, when they would stand in front of the bathroom mirror and see a glimpse of themselves, truly themselves, in a way that felt liberating but bittersweet. In those brief moments of solitude, Jamie would adjust their appearance, finding subtle ways to connect with the person they knew they were beneath the layers of societal and familial expectations. But each time they heard footsteps outside the bathroom door, the reality of their circumstances would crash down upon them, forcing them to revert to the role they were expected to play. The loneliness of this process weighed heavily on Jamie. There was no one in their small, conservative town to confide in, no friend or family member who could understand the complexity of their identity. Online, however, Jamie had found a semblance of community forums, blogs, and social media accounts where people shared their own journeys and offered words of encouragement to others going through similar experiences. These online spaces became Jamie's sanctuary, a place where they felt understood, even if only through a screen. They spent hours reading stories of resilience, scrolling through posts from people who had faced similar obstacles and emerged stronger, more self-assured. These stories offered Jamie a glimmer of hope, a reminder that somewhere, beyond the confines of their family's rules, there was a life worth fighting for. But the more Jamie embraced their identity in secret, the harder it became to conceal it in their day-to-day life. Each act of self-expression felt like a lifeline, a breath of air in an otherwise stifling existence, but it also carried the risk of discovery. The smallest changes did not go unnoticed in the Mahoney household. Jamie's parents, especially their father Richard, were attuned to any deviation from the norm. Richard's strictness bordered on obsession. He believed his duty was to enforce moral discipline, which he equated with strict adherence to gender roles. His religious convictions were the foundation of every decision he made for his family, and any hint of rebellion was swiftly quashed. As Jamie began to quietly express their new identity, Richard's suspicions grew. He noticed the subtle shifts, the way Jamie would linger in front of the mirror a little longer, the small, quiet defiance in their gaze that hadn't been there before. To Richard, these changes were more than adolescent rebellion. They were an affront to the values he had worked so hard to instill. He responded with harsher punishments, stricter rules, and more lectures on the importance of obedience. Jamie was constantly reminded that any deviation from the family's beliefs would be seen as a betrayal, a sin that could not be forgiven. But instead of breaking Jamie, these reactions only deepened their resolve. Each punishment, each act of discipline, felt like another attempt to erase the person they were trying to become. Jamie began to feel as though their family saw them not as an individual but as a possession, a being whose purpose was to reflect the values of the household rather than develop an identity of their own. Their mother, Marie, took a quieter but equally damaging approach. Though she rarely expressed anger directly, her disappointment and disapproval were palpable, leaving Jamie feeling trapped in a web of unspoken expectations and silent judgments. Despite the mounting tension, Jamie continued to push forward, making increasingly bold changes to express their identity. They began saving whatever money they could manage from small chores, eventually purchasing clothes and accessories that reflected who they were. They kept these items hidden, buried at the bottom of drawers or tucked into crevices in their closet, but the act of owning them felt empowering. These small possessions were symbols of defiance, reminders that even within the confines of their family's strict rules, Jamie could still assert a part of themselves. Eventually, Jamie's efforts led them to start experimenting with different names, trying to find one that resonated, one that felt true. The name Jamie had been given to them by their parents, a choice rooted in family tradition, a label that had always felt foreign. But now, as they stood before the mirror, whispering new names to themselves, they felt a growing sense of control. This act, small as it was, became a source of strength. It was a reminder that they had the power to define themselves, even if no one else understood or accepted it. As Jamie's identity solidified, their relationship with their siblings began to change as well. Jamie's brothers and sisters, all younger, were still impressionable, deeply shaped by their parents' teachings. The subtle shifts in Jamie's appearance and demeanor confused them, sparking questions that Jamie struggled to answer without exposing their true self. In moments alone with their siblings, Jamie felt the tug of familial love and responsibility. They longed to tell them the truth, to explain the person they were becoming, but knew it was impossible. Their siblings were too young to understand, and any admission of identity would only put them at risk. The love Jamie felt for them was mixed with an overwhelming sadness, a grief for the relationships that would likely never reach true understanding. The atmosphere in the Mahoney household grew increasingly tense. Richard became more vigilant, his suspicions feeding into a need for control that bordered on paranoia. Jamie's mother grew distant, her disappointment creating a barrier between them that made any genuine connection impossible. Jamie's siblings watched with wide eyes, sensing the unspoken conflict but not yet old enough to comprehend its depth. The tension was palpable, an undercurrent of conflict that simmered beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. Each day, Jamie felt the weight of their family's expectations pressing down harder, the limitations they imposed becoming suffocating. The more Jamie leaned into their true identity, the clearer it became that there was no future for them within their family. Every small act of self-expression came at a cost, met with suspicion, anger, and punishment. Their family's intolerance served as a constant reminder of the life they would never have if they remained in this house. Jamie's new identity, though a source of strength, also felt like a curse of barrier between them and the acceptance they so desperately craved. It was a painful irony that the more they embraced themselves, the more they lost the love and connection they had once clung to. In time, Jamie's patience wore thin. The walls of the Mahoney house, once a place of safety in their childhood, now felt like a prison. Their parents' rules, once tolerable, became chains that bound them to a life of silence and denial. Each punishment, each restrictive rule, felt like a nail sealing the door to a life they could never live. Jamie's new identity, though hidden beneath the surface, burned brighter each day, a fire that could not be contained. The family dinners, the Sunday church services, the nightly prayers, all of it felt hollow, a ritual Jamie could no longer endure. The final realization that Jamie could never find acceptance within their family created a deep, unyielding anger. They began to see their family not as loved ones but as jailers, people who would never understand or allow them to be themselves. Their parents' love had always been conditional, bound by a strict adherence to their beliefs. Jamie's new identity was an affront to everything the Mahoney stood for, a rebellion that could not be tolerated. The painful truth was that their family would never accept them, and in that realization, Jamie's anger solidified into a quiet, determined rage. The realization that there was no place for them within the Mahoney family had sunk deep into Jamie's mind, and with it came an overwhelming sense of clarity, an idea that had been growing, silent and dark, in the back of their mind for months. Jamie knew that staying meant living a life in constant fear, restriction, and erasure. The identity they had fought to recognize, the fragments of selfhood they had pieced together, would be forever stamped out by their family's unyielding rules. Escape was the only answer. And in Jamie's mind, this meant more than just leaving home. For Jamie, escape had come to mean removing every trace of the life that held them captive. The first seeds of the plan came to Jamie on a quiet, sleepless night, when the house was silent, and the weight of their future loomed heavy. Alone in their room, Jamie lay staring into the darkness, listening to the familiar creaks of the old farmhouse as it settled around them. They knew every sound, every shadow that stretched across the floorboards, every crack in the walls where the paint had chipped away. This house had been their prison since birth, and each quiet detail reminded Jamie of a lifetime of stifling control, of their parents' voices commanding obedience, of every suppressed desire and silenced protest. It was then, as they lay in the darkness, that Jamie understood what they needed to do. In the following days, Jamie's actions were deliberate, each step carefully measured. They began to survey their surroundings with a new, strategic eye, observing routines and habits with a detachment that felt almost clinical. Each family member's daily patterns became points of information, details to be stored away and used. They noted the times when the house was quiet, when each family member retired for the night, when the lights went out one by one. Jamie's parents, strict in every aspect of their lives, adhered to a rigid schedule. Richard and Marie went to bed at precisely the same hour each night, while Jamie's younger siblings, too young to understand the tension building in their home, fell asleep shortly after, their innocence shielding them from the turmoil brewing under the surface. Jamie's mental preparation became an obsession, a ritual that gave them a twisted sense of control. The planning felt like a rebellion, a private act of defiance against the life that had confined them. They began to practice moving silently through the house, slipping from room to room without disturbing a single floorboard. In the dead of night, Jamie would practice walking through the hallways, testing for creaks in the floor, mapping out the quietest route from their bedroom to the front door. Each small step forward in their planning made them feel more powerful, more in control of a life they had never been able to claim as their own. Jamie gathered the tools they needed with patience and care. Over weeks, they built a small but deadly collection, items that were innocuous on their own but would serve a deadly purpose when the time came. A kitchen knife, carefully sharpened during their nightly kitchen duties, became their first choice. Jamie knew where every knife was kept in the house, which one had the sharpest edge, which ones their parents would never notice if they went missing for a few hours. They took stock of other items, heavy objects, a length of cord from the garage, anything that could serve as a weapon if necessary. Each object felt like a piece of their plan falling into place, a step closer to freedom. In those final weeks, Jamie's behavior became colder, more detached. They moved through the daily routines with a kind of numbness, their mind focused entirely on the night they would finally put their plan into action. Each morning they went through their chores in silence, enduring their father's scolding and their mother's silent disappointment with a new, dark resolve. The fear and self-doubt that had plagued them for so long were replaced by a quiet, determined rage, an inner fire that had been ignited by years of repression and denial. Their anger became a shield, a barrier that separated them from the family they had once loved but now viewed as enemies, obstacles to be overcome in their quest for liberation. Jamie knew that the moment of truth would come at night, when the household was shrouded in sleep and silence. They chose a night carefully, selecting one when the moon was dark, casting the least light through the windows and allowing the deepest shadows to settle over the house. The timing had to be perfect. Every family member would need to be in a deep, undisturbed sleep, ensuring that no one would interrupt them. Jamie rehearsed their actions over and over in their mind, visualizing every movement, every step from one room to the next, until they knew the plan like a memorized routine. As the chosen night approached, Jamie's nerves felt like tightly wound threads, straining under the weight of what they were about to do. But the resolve in their heart was unwavering. In their mind, this was more than an act of violence. It was a final severing of ties, a reclamation of the life they had been denied. Jamie's thoughts were a mixture of fear and exhilaration, of dread and a desperate hope that somehow this act would free them from the prison of their family's expectations. The night finally arrived, as silent and still as they had anticipated. The Mahoney house was dark, each window like a hollow, unseeing eye. The air inside was thick and heavy, as though the house itself sensed what was about to unfold. Jamie lay in bed, listening to the quiet breathing of their siblings down the hall, the faint rustling of their parents turning in bed, unaware of the danger lying just a few rooms away. Jamie's heart pounded in their chest, each beat like a drum marking the countdown to freedom. They rose from their bed and moved with purpose, each step deliberate and rehearsed. In their hand, the knife felt heavy, grounding them, reminding them that there was no going back. With each step through the silent halls, Jamie's mind grew clearer, their movements more certain. The resentment, the anger, the years of repression, all of it culminated in this moment, a final release of the person they had been forced to bury beneath layers of denial and control. As Jamie moved through the house, they felt a strange calm settle over them. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every shadow on the walls seemed to blur as they approached their parents' room. The plan they had so carefully crafted was now unfolding, and with each movement, they felt themselves drawing closer to the freedom they had longed for. The family that had kept them prisoner would no longer hold power over them. They were ready to sever the ties that had bound them to a life of silence and conformity. In those final moments, Jamie's mind was empty, focused only on the actions they had spent so long preparing for. The house was silent, the stillness thick and oppressive as Jamie moved through the darkened hallways. Each step was careful, practiced, an echo of the countless nights they had spent preparing for this moment. The walls of the old farmhouse loomed around them, familiar yet alien, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and shift like silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. Jamie's movements were steady, purposeful, each one a final act in the life they were leaving behind. They felt the weight of the knife in their hand, its cold metal pressing against their palm, grounding them in the reality of their decision. Jamie's father, Richard, was the first. They moved into his room with slow, calculated steps, their face a mask of calm as they approached the bed where he lay in a deep, untroubled sleep. His breathing was steady, rhythmic, a sound Jamie had listened to every night for years from down the hall. In this moment, all the memories of his reprimands, his punishments, his unyielding control flooded Jamie's mind. This man who had dictated every aspect of their life, who had stamped out their identity piece by piece, lay vulnerable before them. Jamie's heart pounded, each beat echoing in their ears as they took a final breath and raised the knife. In one swift, precise motion, it was over. The sound was minimal, but Jamie knew they had to be quick. Any noise, any accidental creak could awaken the rest of the family, so they moved silently, focused only on the plan they had rehearsed 1,000 times in their mind. Their mother Marie was next, lying still beside her husband, blissfully unaware of what had just occurred. Jamie watched her for a moment, noting the serene expression on her face, the faint lines of worry that never left her even in sleep. Those lines had deepened over the years as she watched her oldest child drift further from the obedient figure she had hoped to shape. But for Jamie, her expression held no sympathy. She had been complicit, a silent enforcer of Richard's oppressive rules, a shadow that followed every command without question. Moving with the same precision, Jamie approached her side of the bed and repeated the act, each movement fueled by the memories of her quiet disappointment, her unspoken disdain for the person Jamie had become. The release was immediate, a strange, detached relief as Jamie withdrew, leaving the room and closing the door softly behind them. The house was still quiet, its occupants completely unaware of the horror unfolding within its walls. Jamie moved down the hall toward the rooms where their younger siblings lay. The small, steady breaths of their brothers and sisters were audible even through closed doors, a faint reminder of their innocence, their youth, their lives untouched by the turmoil Jamie had endured. As Jamie entered each room, they felt a pang of sorrow mixed with an iron resolve. These were children, too young to fully understand the expectations and control that had dominated Jamie's life. They were still untouched by the judgments and punishments their parents had inflicted upon Jamie, but Jamie knew that in time they too would be molded into obedient shadows, reflections of Richard's vision for the family. In the dim light, Jamie looked down at their siblings, each one lying peacefully, unaware of the storm that had been brewing within their family for so long. The younger children Lily, Sarah, and Ben looked almost angelic, their small faces calm, framed by soft curls and gentle breaths. Jamie hesitated briefly, memories of laughter and play flashing through their mind, of stolen moments when they felt like a sibling, not an outcast. But the resolve returned quickly, driven by the knowledge that leaving any member of this family alive would be leaving a part of the life that had sought to destroy them. With each step forward, the memories of every hurt, every punishment, every silencing word echoed in Jamie's mind. This act, brutal and irreversible, was their way of claiming freedom, of severing the final ties to a life that had denied them everything. Jamie moved through the room, the familiar dark determination overtaking any lingering hesitation. They approached each bed in silence, carrying out the act with the same precision they had practiced in their mind. Each moment felt suspended, stretching infinitely, and then collapsing into nothing as they moved from room to room. When they reached the final bedroom, Jamie paused outside the door, gripping the knife tightly. The house was heavy with the silence of what they had done, each room a reminder of the family they had left behind in the dark. Jamie stood motionless, the enormity of their actions settling over them like a shroud, yet they felt no urge to turn back, no desire to undo what had been done. Their mind was numb, their heart steady, as they opened the last door and entered, moving with the same quiet purpose that had guided every step. When Jamie emerged from the room, the house was bathed in darkness, a final silence hanging over it like a veil. They moved back through the hallways, past each closed door, noting the faint rustling of sheets, the stillness of a life that had been ended. The home that had once confined them, that had served as a cage for their true self, was now empty, its oppressive hold broken at last. Jamie took a final, sweeping look through the rooms, their gaze lingering on the worn furniture, the familiar objects that had once been a part of their daily life. Each room held memories, remnants of a life they had despised yet endured for so many years. Now the house felt almost foreign, a hollow shell stripped of the power it once held over them. They walked through the living room, pausing only to take a few essential belongings, their movements methodical as they prepared to leave this place forever. The night was cool as Jamie stepped outside, the air crisp and clear, free of the heavy silence that clung to the house behind them. They felt a strange calm as they walked away, each step carrying them further from the life they had escaped. The stars above shone coldly, indifferent witnesses to the tragedy that had unfolded below. Jamie took a deep breath, inhaling the night air, the freedom, the unfamiliar sensation of being untethered from everything that had once defined them. In that moment, Jamie felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, sorrow, and a sense of liberation that was almost surreal. The life they had left behind, along with the people who had held them captive, was now only a memory, a dark chapter that had finally come to an end. By dawn, the Mahoney house had become eerily silent. When neighbors noticed that Richard and Marie's truck hadn't moved from the driveway and the house remained quiet well into the morning, a sense of unease began to settle over the street. This was a family known for their discipline and routine, early risers who kept their home in strict order. When a concerned neighbor finally mustered the courage to knock and got no response, they called the local sheriff's department, worried something was wrong. When the police arrived, they were met with a grim and horrific scene. Each room bore the signs of violence, the family found lifeless in the place that had once been their safe haven. Officers moved through the home, piecing together the brutal story as best they could in stunned silence, each detail deepening the tragedy of what had unfolded. The Mahoney family, a fixture of their small town known for their conservative values and large, orderly household, had been shattered. As word spread through the town, disbelief turned to sorrow, then horror, as the realization settled that this was no accident but a carefully executed, deliberate act. The Mahoney house quickly became a crime scene, and a small crowd gathered outside as officials moved in and out of the home, trying to process the details. People murmured in shock, clutching one another, neighbors struggling to understand how a family they thought they knew could be struck by such violence. The Mahoneys had always been respected in the community, seen as strict but upstanding people, a family that embodied traditional values. For many in the town, the Mahoneys represented a kind of moral ideal, a family that upheld discipline, religious values, and a strong sense of identity. That all of them had been killed in their own home left the community shaken, the image of the perfect family shattered. As investigators began to piece together the events of that night, suspicion quickly turned to Jamie, the Mahoneys' eldest child. When the officers found that Jamie was missing and had left behind only a few scattered belongings, the story began to shift. Jamie was nowhere to be found, and their absence felt like an answer in itself, raising more questions about what might have driven them to such an act. Rumors began to spread through the town, speculations about Jamie's motives and what could have led to such an unimaginable crime. Whispers of family tensions, disobedience, and rebellion filled the conversations, as people struggled to make sense of the tragedy that had unfolded in their quiet community. The town was left reeling as details emerged. Former classmates and acquaintances spoke about Jamie in hushed tones, recalling someone who had always seemed different, who had drifted from the others, who had never quite fit the mold expected of them. Teachers and neighbors reflected on small hints of tension, moments that, in retrospect, took on a chilling significance. But no one had imagined that this difference, this quiet resistance, could have culminated in such a violent rupture. The conservative values that the Mahoneys had so staunchly upheld were now being questioned, as people wondered whether the strictness of Jamie's upbringing had been too harsh, too unforgiving. Many who had admired the family's discipline now pondered whether those very values had contributed to the tragedy. In the following days, a statewide manhunt began. Jamie was officially listed as a suspect, their face appearing on the news as law enforcement combed through neighboring towns and cities, spreading their photograph, questioning anyone who might have seen them. But Jamie, familiar with the town's routines and careful in their planning, had managed to disappear without leaving a clear trail. By the time the search was in full swing, Jamie had traveled far, moving quietly from place to place, leaving behind only a shadow of their old identity. Alone on the road, Jamie felt the weight of their actions settle heavily on them, but the fear and urgency of their escape left little room for reflection. They were constantly on edge, moving between motels, bus stations, and small diners, avoiding anyone who might recognize them. Every step away from their hometown felt like both a relief and a haunting reminder of what they had left behind. Jamie blended into the background, keeping their head low, constantly aware of the gazes around them, as if everyone could somehow see the truth of their actions. They learned to change their appearance, taking on different styles, mannerisms, and even accents to avoid suspicion. The skills they had honed in hiding their identity at home now became tools for survival. As days turned into weeks, the story of the Mahoney family massacre spread beyond the borders of their small town, making headlines in nearby cities. The media painted a portrait of Jamie that was incomplete and sensationalized, focusing on their troubled youth and rebellious nature, the estranged child who had rejected their family's values. The narrative twisted Jamie into a mysterious figure, an enigma that both horrified and fascinated the public. Rumors circulated, some claiming that Jamie had been possessed, others that they were mentally ill, or that they had been under the influence of dark forces. Few people, if any, considered that their motivations might have been rooted in years of repression, isolation, and pain. The town held a funeral for the Mahoney family, a gathering marked by an outpouring of grief and confusion. The community, many of whom had attended church services with the Mahoneys, gathered to mourn, but beneath the sorrow was an unspoken anger, a resentment toward the child they saw as the betrayer, the one who had taken everything from the family they revered. Some spoke of the Mahoneys with reverence, viewing them as martyrs to the values the town held dear. Others were left with lingering questions, wondering whether the family's unyielding beliefs had contributed to the tragedy. Jamie continued to travel, haunted by a mixture of emotions that they could barely begin to process. There was a numbness that settled over them, a hollow feeling left by the enormity of what they had done. They avoided their own reflection, unable to confront the person they had become. At times, in moments of quiet, the weight of their actions would crash down upon them, filling them with a nameless dread that seemed to consume them from within. Yet beneath the guilt and fear was an undeniable sense of freedom, a release from the life they had known, from the expectations that had confined them. Jamie remained a phantom in the weeks that followed, a figure slipping from one place to the next, leaving no trace, no ties. They lived off what little they had taken with them, keeping to themselves, speaking only when necessary, always on alert. They were free, yes, but the cost of that freedom haunted every step they took, a dark reminder that there was no going back. They had severed every connection to their old life, every tie to the person they once were, leaving behind only the remnants of a family that had tried to define them, to erase them. The town, though haunted by the tragedy, eventually returned to its routines, though the Mahoney house remained empty, a silent monument to the family that had once filled it. People continued to speak of the tragedy in hushed tones, using it as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of rebellion and the importance of obedience. Jamie, however, had slipped beyond their reach, a figure who would remain elusive, a shadow that could never be reclaimed. As Jamie continued their journey, they left behind every marker of their former self, a person who no longer existed, erased as thoroughly as the family they had left behind. They walked into an uncertain future, carrying the weight of their actions, their freedom bound by the memory of what they had done, and the knowledge that they could never truly escape the past that had shaped them.